Hello, everyone. Professor Kurzluck here. So I wanted to spend some time thinking about elections some more, particularly administering elections. So when most people think about elections, they probably think of like campaign ads, which we can't avoid. They're on YouTube, they're on TV when you're just trying to watch football or whatever you're into. You are exposed to campaign ads. So we oftentimes think of campaign ads, maybe debates. If you're paying a little bit more attention to politics, you'll know that hey, there's a presidential debate or a Senate debate coming up, and many Americans tune into those. Not everyone, but a decent amount of people tune into those debates. Maybe it's waiting in line for election day, and that's your relationship with voting. Or if you're in Colorado, when you're sending your ballot in, you're filling your ballot out at your house, or you're getting your blue book that comes in the mail that helps you know what's on the ballot. So when you think of elections, maybe those things come to mind. Waiting in line, TV commercials, maybe that's what comes to mind. But we know that elections are much more than just those single events, those single moments of voting. Instead, they are complex systems with many parts, and the way these systems are designed and managed actually has a pretty big consequence for who participates, how votes are counted, and how much trust citizens have in the outcome of the election. Do citizens trust the outcome? So I wanted to make this video talking about our reading from Administering Elections, chapter 1 and 2. We talked about a lot of this in class, but I just wanted to make sure we were all on the same page with the main takeaways from the reading. So the author in the first chapter of Administering Elections asks us to take this systems perspective. Instead of treating election day as a singular event, as one event that we engage with, we should instead recognize it as accumulation of several interconnected subsystems. So what does that mean? Well, the authors argue that this includes voter registration, the recruitment and training of poll workers, maybe something we never think about, who actually has to work on elections and who is actually working behind the scenes to make sure elections go smoothly. So registration, the recruitment and training of poll workers, the organization of precincts and polling places, ballot design, ballot distribution, voting technology. Now, voting technology is probably in the news more today than it was a decade ago. We can use the example from 2 decades ago of the 2000 Florida ballots that were confusing, the butterfly ballots, where maybe some voters were confused about who they actually were voting for. So voting technology and voting ballot design, maybe something we don't think about in our daily lives when we think about elections as hallmark of a democracy. But people are out there thinking about designing systems to make voting as accurate and transparent as possible. There's also polling place operations and counting and certification. Now, certification's in the news quite a lot around elections because we know it's become a bit more covered by the media because of claims of improprieties at polling locations. So the certification process and then auditing of results, which we saw in the 2020 election, that auditing was talked about a lot. States auditing to make sure the vote totals were accurate. So each of these components is essential in a democracy. Voter registration determines who can cast a ballot and, importantly, where. If they have to go to a brick and mortar location to vote, registration will assign a location for that voter to go to so they know where to go and they can vote in confidence and they can vote and they're allowed. So we have seen major reforms in these areas, from the Motor Voter Act of 1993, which requires the DMV to offer registration, to more recent experiments with online registration or even automatic registration. Yet we still know that problems remain. There are the issues and the concerns of outdated voter rolls, inconsistent purges of voter rolls. So maybe when people move, they don't update their address at their old voting location, and then a state will purge that voting roll because the information is old. But there's a concern that are people being purged that maybe still live in the area, still want to vote in that area, but they get purged and they get caught up when these legitimate people are being removed from voter rolls. So that is a concern when we think about who is able to vote. Is everybody that is previously registered and wants to vote, are they able to vote? So we do see outdated rolls, we see these inconsistent purges of rolls, and we know there are partisan disputes over how inclusive or restrictive registration practices should be. Should it be same-day voting registration versus you have to register weeks in advance? These are debates that, remember, states handle elections themselves. Some federal government oversight, but much of that power is given to the states. And then they can make these policies on their own. Okay, so registration, absolutely. Maybe you've encountered registration if you registered to vote yourself. The next, let's talk a little bit about poll workers. These poll workers who, if you've ever voted in person, you would have interacted with, you would have engaged with, talked to, signed in, maybe showed your ID if you live in a state that requires IDs. So these poll workers really form the backbone of elections. They check voters in. You walk into wherever you vote at if you vote in person. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, and I used to vote in a church my first few elections. That's just where the polls were. And so you walk in, I would walk into church, and there would be a person there to check me in. These poll workers distribute ballots, they troubleshoot machines, and they keep the process going. This is particularly important in presidential elections, where the process needs to be kept up at a decent pace, so there's not a backlog of people waiting to vote. We see, though, that there are even here some complexities that maybe we don't think about. Many poll workers are older, they're part-time, and they are oftentimes under-trained. So as we see more and more technology being used in elections and polling locations, we know that maybe the older poll workers, the technology is a little bit more sophisticated and difficult for them to utilize and handle. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, when older volunteers were less likely or less able to serve, maybe due to concerns about health, some states did face a pretty severe shortage of poll workers, which was really this reminder that even there is still this human element of election administration that maybe, again, we don't think about how elections actually worked. So precincts, polling places are another piece of this puzzle. Where polling places are located and how many are available can absolutely dramatically shape voter turnout. We've seen that closures have disproportionately affected either minority or rural communities. So very rural communities or in very condensed, poorer areas of cities. So, for example, after the Supreme Court's Shelby County versus Holder decision in 2013, which really weakened federal oversight, many counties reduced polling locations. At the same time, some jurisdictions have moved towards vote centers where voters can cast ballots at any location of the county. But these require more reliable technology to work properly. So we see that there have been changes over the past decade where some people have seemingly had to wait in line longer. So we've seen this in places like Atlanta, Georgia, where in some communities people had to wait in line for 8 hours. So that is a piece of the voting process. How easy is it for people to even be able to vote? So ballot design can also make a difference. Ballot design might seem or sound technical, but history shows that it is important. It's not just something to pass over. The butterfly ballot used in Palm Beach County, Florida in 2000 reportedly confused voters and may have altered the outcome of the presidential race. We, of course, can't say that for sure. We know it's debated, but if you read about the event, you can hear opposing sides. One side saying yes, the outcome was impacted because of this confusing butterfly ballot. Today, administrators also face the challenge of producing ballots in multiple languages and designing them for accessibility, so as many people as possible have access to these ballots. So the voting technology has also been central to recent debates. After the problems of 2000, Congress passed the Help America Vote Act, which poured money into new machines. But technology continues to spark concerns. Some states use electronic poll books and touchscreen systems, while others insist on paper backups to prevent hacking and to help with the auditing process to make sure that people feel secure that their vote is being counted the way they voted. So, in one of the bipartisan reforms that gained traction after 2020 was requiring these paper audit trails, that even if you're voting by machine, there is still a paper ballot. So if an audit needs to occur, there is a paper trail. And this allowed that voters could trust their votes were actually being recorded the way they wanted. So finally, the processes of counting and certification reminds us that elections don't end on election day. Voters ideally have faith that their election was that their vote was counted properly. So we do see that at times, especially during really close races, there will be audits. There can be audits. We've seen audits over the past decade where people wanted to verify that the way that people had voted is actually how they were counted. So when we think about the first chapter from our reading, the key lesson is that elections are reliant on a lot of infrastructure that maybe we don't see a lot. So chapter 2 shifts that focus from subsystems to the question of structure. Who actually runs elections in the United States? Here, the central theme for the author is decentralization. Unlike many democracies that have a single, independent National Election Commission, the United States relies on a patchwork of state and local governments, with some but limited federal oversight. So local governments, thus, are the workhorse of election administration. In most states, counties bear the primary responsibility, handling registration, setting up the poll locations, making sure equipment is working and functioning, and counting votes. Now, we know there are some exceptions, like in New England, but for the most part, counties have this power and this responsibility. So we also know that states have oversight. There are what our reading calls CEOs, overlooking though the entire process. Sometimes they're elected, sometimes they are elected by the voters. Other times they are selected and put into those roles. And these folks, these individuals, make sure that the elections are running smoothly, that the machines are set up, that they're up to date and trustworthy. So when we think of elections, we might think of our role, just going and voting at the ballot box or voting by mail. But from these two chapters from our reading, we see that the election process relies heavily on these many different pieces. This systems perspective that our author argues, that it is these pieces working together that make sure that we can vote and our votes are counted, they can be audited if needed, and that we can be secure and rely and believe the election results are what they are. Thank you.